On a humid August night in 1802, somewhere within the corridors of Monticello, the Virginia mountaintop estate of Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States, a teenage girl named Sally Hemings gave birth to her third child. The infant's skin was pale, his features unmistakably resembling the man who penned the words, "All men are created equal." Yet no doctor was summoned. No birth was recorded in any official ledger. By morning, the child existed only in whispered conversations among the enslaved people who worked the plantation's hidden dependencies. For the next 2 centuries, the Jefferson family would deny what happened on that mountain. They would burn letters, destroy records, and silence anyone who dared speak the truth. But the shadows of Monticello remember everything. Before we continue with the story of America's most revered founding father and the woman he kept in bondage, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Virginia or anywhere in the United States where these stories took place, leave a comment telling me what state you're from. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the birth of American democracy. Now, let's descend into the darkness that Thomas Jefferson worked his entire life to conceal. The truth about Monticello begins not with grand ideals, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a place where terrible secrets are kept. Albemarle County, Virginia, in the summer of 1802, stretched across rolling Piedmont hills where tobacco plantations dotted the landscape like scattered kingdoms. Each estate operated as its own isolated world, governed by white masters whose word was absolute law. The county seat at Charlottesville remained a modest village of fewer than 600 souls, but 30-mile rough roads connected it to Richmond, where Virginia's legislature conducted the business of the young republic. Monticello itself stood atop an 850-foot mountain that Jefferson had spent decades reshaping to match his architectural vision. The main house, with its distinctive dome and classical columns, faced west toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, but the elegant facade concealed something darker. Along Mulberry Row, a 1,000-foot stretch of dependencies running along the hillside, nearly 130 enslaved people lived and worked in conditions that contradicted every principle Jefferson claimed to hold dear. The summer of 1802 brought oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the mountain like a physical weight. Tobacco leaves wilted in the fields. The air hung thick with moisture that made breathing difficult and tempers short. Jefferson had returned to Monticello in late July, escaping the political turmoil of Washington City, where Federalist newspapers had begun printing rumors that made his hand shake when he read them over breakfast. James Callender, a Scottish journalist Jefferson had once funded to attack his political enemies, had turned on him with venomous fury. The Richmond Recorder now published allegations that President Jefferson kept a concubine at Monticello, a woman named Sally Hemings, who was, according to Callender, his slave. The articles described children of mixed race running through the plantation, suggesting they bore striking resemblance to the president himself. Jefferson's response was silence, absolute calculated silence. Sally Hemings was 29 years old that summer, though she looked younger. Her skin was described by those who saw her as nearly white, her features delicate, her manner quiet. She had arrived at Monticello as a girl of 14, brought back from Paris where she had served Jefferson's daughter Maria during his diplomatic posting. In France, she could have claimed freedom. French law did not recognize slavery. Instead, she returned to Virginia, to Monticello, to a life of servitude that would span decades. Her children told their own story. Beverly, born in 1798, was 4 years old that summer. Harriet, born in 1799, had died in infancy. Now another child grew inside her, and the enslaved people of Mulberry Row spoke in whispers about who the father might be, though everyone knew the answer. They had learned long ago that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Thomas Jefferson himself was 59 years old, recently widowed for 20 years after the death of Martha Wales Jefferson, who had made him promise never to remarry. He had kept that promise in the narrowest technical sense, though the reality of his domestic arrangements would have horrified the wife he claimed to honor. He rose each morning at dawn, recording the temperature, checking his gardens, managing the endless details of plantation life with the same meticulous attention he brought to drafting legislation. His account books tracked everything: the bushels of wheat harvested, the pounds of nails manufactured in his workshop, the bolts of cloth distributed to the enslaved people twice yearly. But some things remained unrecorded. Some transactions left no paper trail. The household at Monticello in 1802 included Jefferson's daughters, Martha and Maria, though both were married and maintained their own households. When Jefferson was in residence, the mansion came alive with intellectual activity, scientific experiments, musical performances, libraries overflowing with books in multiple languages. But this refined culture existed only in the main house. Beyond those walls, a different world operated according to different rules. Jupiter Evans had served Jefferson since childhood, accompanying him to college, had William and Mary, standing beside him through decades of public service. Now elderly, Jupiter managed the stables with the kind of intimate knowledge that came from a lifetime of service or captivity, depending on how one chose to frame it. His son John worked the blacksmith forge, the rhythmic hammer strikes echoing across the plantation from dawn until dusk. Martin Hemings ran the mansion's dining operations with precision that would have impressed any Philadelphia hotel. His brother Robert worked in the joinery, crafting furniture of such quality that visitors assumed it came from European craftsmen. Peter Hemings controlled the kitchen, cooking French-inspired cuisine that amazed Jefferson's guests. The Hemings family formed an unusual aristocracy among the enslaved population. Lighter-skinned, granted special privileges, living in better quarters than the field hands who worked tobacco in the sweltering heat. Rumors suggested they shared blood with the Jefferson family through Martha Wales, Jefferson's father, John Wales, who had allegedly fathered several children with his enslaved housekeeper, Elizabeth Hemings. If true, it meant Sally Hemings was Martha Jefferson's half-sister, and Jefferson had chosen to enslave his late wife's own blood relatives. But again, these were matters never discussed openly. The architecture of Monticello itself seemed designed to hide such uncomfortable realities. Jefferson had installed narrow staircases in the walls, allowing enslaved people to move through the house while remaining invisible to guests. They could bring food to the dining room, tend fires, change linens, all without ever being seen. The house operated like a machine, its human components deliberately concealed from view. On Mulberry Row, the dependencies spread out in a carefully organized line. The smokehouse, the dairy, the textile workshop, where enslaved women spun thread and woolcloth. The nailery, where teenage boys manufactured thousands of nails weekly, their hands scarred and burned from the hot metal. The quarters themselves were cramped wooden structures, some barely 12 feet square, housing entire families in conditions Jefferson's dogs would have found inadequate. Yet Jefferson recorded everything as profit and loss. Human beings reduced to accounting entries. Sold Sally's brother James to John Barnes for $200. Purchased cloth for Negro clothing, 47 yards. The language was clinical, removing all humanity from transactions that involved real people with hopes, fears, dreams, and memories of their own. The tobacco economy dominated Virginia in 1802. Though Jefferson himself had grown disillusioned with the crop, it exhausted soil, demanded intensive labor, and tied planters to a boom-and-bust cycle that left many drowning in debt. Jefferson owed thousands to British creditors, obligations that predated the Revolution and grew larger each year as interest compounded. The enslaved people of Monticello represented his largest liquid asset. He could have sold them to clear his debts, but he needed their labor to maintain his lifestyle. This was the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Jefferson's existence. He wrote eloquently about liberty, while depending entirely on slavery. He advocated for limited government while exercising absolute authority over the people he owned. He mourned the corrupting influence of slavery on white children raised to command, yet he allowed his own grandchildren to grow up giving orders to people old enough to be their grandparents. The political situation in 1802 added another layer of tension. Jefferson had won the presidency after the constitutional crisis of 1800, when the Electoral College tied between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's longtime nemesis, had broken the deadlock by persuading Federalists to support Jefferson over Burr, whom Hamilton considered even more dangerous. Now Jefferson worked to dismantle Hamilton's financial system, reduce the national debt, shrink the military, and roll back Federalist policies. But the calendar articles threatened to destroy his presidency before his reforms could take effect. If the American people believed their president kept a slave concubine, if they learned about the children of mixed race at Monticello, the resulting scandal might bring down not just Jefferson but the entire Republican Party. So, Jefferson did what he had learned to do over decades of public life. He remained silent. He kept working, and he trusted that eventually the rumors would fade. In his mind, private morality remained separate from public virtue. What happened at Monticello was his own business, nobody else's concern. But Sally Hemings was not a political abstraction. She was a real woman, pregnant again that summer, facing the prospect of bringing another child into slavery under the roof of the man who owned her, who slept with her, who fathered her children while publicly denying even knowing her name. The other enslaved people of Monticello watched and understood. They saw the children who looked like Jefferson. They noticed when Sally disappeared into the main house at night. They observed how Jefferson tracked her whereabouts with the same attention he gave to his experimental crops. And they kept silent because speaking meant punishment. Separation, sailed to the deep South where slavery was even more brutal than Virginia. This was the world Sally Hemings inhabited on that hot August night in 1802. A world of silence, secrecy, and careful performance. A world where everyone knew the truth, but nobody dared speak it. A world where the author of the Declaration of Independence exercised complete control over a woman who had no legal right to refuse him, no ability to protect her children, no hope of escape except the grave. The heat that summer became oppressive by August. Temperatures climbed into the 90s day after day. The air felt thick as wool, making sleep difficult, tempers volatile. In the main house, Jefferson suffered from one of his periodic headaches. The migraines that plagued him during times of stress. He sequestered himself in his cabinet, working on correspondence, avoiding visitors, pretending the world beyond Monticello did not exist. The night of August 19, 1802 began like dozens before it. The sun set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains around 8,000, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if anyone had the luxury to appreciate them. Most of the enslaved people of Mulberry Row finished their work and retreated to their quarters, bone-tired from another day of labor and crushing heat. Sally Hemings felt the first contractions around 900. She had been through this before. This would be her fourth pregnancy. Though only one child, Beverly, had survived, she knew what was coming, knew the pain that would build and crest like ocean waves. Knew she would need help to get through the night ahead, but she couldn't call for a doctor. Jefferson didn't summon physicians for enslaved births. The expense wasn't justified for property that might not survive. Instead, the enslaved community had developed its own network of care, its own knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to deliver babies without formal training, using techniques that blended African traditions with practical experience. Critter Hemings, Sally's older sister, came first when word spread through Mulberry Row. She was 42 years old, a veteran of too many births, too many losses. Her own children had been scattered across Virginia, sold, hired out, sent away when Jefferson needed cash or wanted to remove potential problems. But she remained at Monticello, and she knew what to do when a woman went into labor. They gathered in Sally's small cabin along Mulberry Row, a structure barely 14 feet square with a single window and a fireplace that provided heat in winter, but made the space unbearable during summer. The furniture was minimal: a narrow bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a trunk containing Sally's few possessions. Candlelight flickered against rough wooden walls, creating shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. Critter sent Beverly away with one of the other children. The boy was too young to witness what was coming, and besides, it was better if he didn't see his mother in pain. Some things children should be spared, even enslaved children who would grow up to learn that protection was a luxury they couldn't afford. The labor progressed through the night. Sally tried to remain quiet. Jefferson's bedroom window faced Mulberry Row, and sound carried easily in the stillness. She bit down on cloth strips to muffle her cries, even though the pain was extraordinary. Childbirth is always dangerous, but for enslaved women in 1802, it carried additional terror. There was no anesthesia, no real medical care if something went wrong, no assurance that anyone would save the mother if a choice had to be made. By midnight, other women had arrived. Priscilla Hemings, another sister, Betsy Hemings, Sally's niece. They brought water heated over fires, cloths torn from worn fabric, herbal remedies that might ease pain or prevent infection. They had done this countless times before, delivering babies in darkness, in secret, in conditions that would have horrified any civilized observer. Around 2:00 in the morning, Sally's water broke. The contractions intensified, coming faster, harder, demanding all her strength just to breathe through them. Critter checked her progress with experienced hands, murmuring encouragement that felt like prayers. "Soon now," she whispered. "Soon." But there was a problem. Critter felt it before she said anything. The baby wasn't positioned right. Instead of head down, ready to enter the world in the usual way, something was wrong. Critter had seen this before. Sometimes babies came breech feet first, turning birth into a race against time and death. She didn't tell Sally immediately. No point causing panic. Instead, She sent Priscilla to find more help to wake anyone who might have experience with difficult deliveries. Minutes mattered now. If this went wrong, both mother and child could die, and there would be no way to explain it to Jefferson without revealing the entire situation. The summer night pressed in around the small cabin like a physical presence. Outside, cicadas screamed their mating calls, a sound that seemed to grow louder as the night wore on. The air inside the cabin became stifling despite the open window. Too many people in too small a space. Body heat adding to the oppressive temperature, Sally's pain reached levels that made silence impossible. She cried out, a sound that echoed across Mulberry Row and probably reached the main house. If Jefferson heard, he gave no sign. His bedroom remained dark. No lamp lit. No indication he knew or cared what was happening less than 200 YD from where he slept. Critter made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. The baby had to come out now, regardless of position, regardless of risk. She coached Sally through the pushing, using all her knowledge and experience to guide a body that didn't want to cooperate. "Push," she commanded, her voice low but fierce. "Push hard as you can." Sally pushed. She pushed until she thought she would split in half, until lights danced at the edges of her vision, until she couldn't imagine surviving another moment of this torture. And then something shifted. The baby came suddenly, all at once. A slippery rush of limbs and fluid that Critter caught in her practiced hands. For one terrible moment, the infant didn't breathe, didn't cry, just lay silent and still in the candlelight while every woman in the room held their breath. Then Critter turned the baby over, cleared its mouth and nose, and delivered a sharp smack to its tiny back. The child gasped, coughed, and began to wail, a strong, angry sound that meant life, survival, a soul entering a world that had already decided it would be property. "A girl," Critter announced, wrapping the infant in clean cloth. "Healthy, as far as I can tell." The women released their collective breath. Sally reached for her daughter with shaking hands, pulling the baby to her chest, feeling the weight of this new life she had brought into existence. In the candlelight, the infant's skin appeared pale, lighter even than Sally's, almost white. Her features, still swollen and red from birth, already suggested who her father was. Anyone with eyes could see it. This was the terrible truth that would haunt Monticello for decades to come. The physical evidence literally embodied in flesh and blood that Thomas Jefferson had repeatedly impregnated a woman he owned, a woman who could not legally consent, a woman whose children would be born into the same slavery he publicly condemned. Sally named her daughter Harriet, the same name as the baby who had died 3 years earlier. Perhaps she hoped this child would survive where the other had not. Perhaps she wanted to resurrect something lost. Or perhaps names mattered so little in a world where enslaved people could be renamed at their owner's whim that it didn't matter what she called this girl. Critter cleaned up the birth, disposing of the afterbirth, washing Sally, changing the soiled bedding. By dawn, the cabin looked almost normal, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The other women drifted back to their own quarters, catching what little sleep they could before the day's work began. Beverly returned around sunrise, peeking in to see his mother holding a bundled infant. He was too young to understand the full implications of what had occurred, but old enough to sense that something important had changed. He had a sister now, another person connected to him by blood and bondage. Jefferson emerged from the main house around 6 Henning, as he did every morning, and walked his gardens. His account book that day recorded the temperature, 78 degrees at dawn, promising another scorching day. He noted that the figs were ripening, that the corn looked promising, that he needed to write letters to Madison and Monroe about political matters in Washington. There was no mention of a birth, no acknowledgement that his enslaved population had increased by 1, no indication he knew or cared that Sally Hemings had nearly died bringing his daughter into the world. The silence was deliberate, calculated, necessary to maintain the fiction that allowed Jefferson to function as both president and slaveholder, both philosopher and hypocrite, both liberator and oppressor. But silences are never complete. Information spreads through networks that resist official control. The enslaved people of Monticello knew about Harriet's birth within hours. By the following week, neighboring plantations had heard rumors. Within a month, whispers reached Charlottesville, though nobody dared speak openly about what everyone knew. James Calenderer, still publishing his inflammatory articles in Richmond, didn't learn about Harriet's birth immediately, but he didn't need to. He already had enough material to damage Jefferson's reputation. The timing, however, would prove significant. This birth, this child, would become another piece of evidence in a pattern that Jefferson could never adequately explain. In the days following Harriet's birth, life at Monticello returned to its normal rhythms. The tobacco needed harvesting. The nail ailery needed supervision. The endless maintenance of the estate demanded attention. Sally recovered slowly, weakened by blood loss and the trauma of difficult labor. Critter brought her food, checked her healing, warned her to rest, even though rest was a luxury enslaved women couldn't afford. Jefferson departed for Washington City in October, leaving Monticello under the supervision of his estate manager. He would be gone for months conducting the business of the presidency, pushing his agenda through a hostile Congress, dealing with foreign affairs and domestic politics. The child he had fathered remained behind, growing slowly in a cabin along Mulberry Row, cared for by a mother who loved her, but couldn't protect her from the future that awaited all enslaved children. This was the event that crystallized everything wrong with Monticello. Not supernatural horror, but something worse. The banal, ordinary evil of a system that allowed human beings to be treated as property, that permitted men to exercise complete control over women who had no legal right to refuse them, that created children destined for slavery under the roof of the man who wrote that all men were created equal. The horror was what happened that August night. The horror was that it was legal, accepted, woven into the fabric of American society. The horror was that it would continue for another 60 years, protected by law, defended by theologians, enforced by violence. The horror was that Jefferson could father children with an enslaved woman and face no consequences, no accountability, no requirement to acknowledge what everyone knew, but nobody could prove. The years following Harriet's birth transformed Monticello into something darker than a mere plantation. It became a carefully maintained lie, a performance staged for the benefit of visitors who came to meet the great Thomas Jefferson, but never looked too closely at how his estate actually operated. Little Harriet grew quickly in those early years, and her appearance became increasingly difficult to explain away. By age 3, she looked unmistakably white, pale skin, light hair, features that mirrored the man who occasionally returned from Washington City and walked past her without acknowledgement. The enslaved people of Mulberry Row learned to keep her out of sight when important visitors arrived, understanding instinctively that her existence contradicted the story Jefferson told the world. Beverly, now 6 years old when his sister was born, developed into a bright, observant child who understood far more than adults wished he did. He watched how white children visiting Monticello played freely while he and Harriet had to remain in designated areas. He noticed how Jefferson's legitimate grandchildren received education, books, musical instruments, while enslaved children received nothing but orders and occasional scraps of food. The household staff, primarily members of the Hemings family, developed elaborate strategies to maintain Jefferson's comfortable delusion. They timed Sally's movements to ensure she never crossed paths with visitors. They kept her children hidden during social events. They maintained the fiction that Jefferson was merely a kindly master who treated his slaves well, rather than a man who had fathered multiple children with a woman he owned. Jefferson himself perfected the art of selective blindness. He recorded everything else in his account books: the weather, crop yields, financial transactions, scientific observations. But Sally Hemings appeared in his records only as Sally, listed among the enslaved people assigned to household duties. Her children received even less attention. Beverly and Harriet existed in his ledgers only as numbers in the annual inventory of his human property, but maintaining silence required constant effort. In 1805, another pregnancy. Sally was pregnant again, visibly so by early spring. The whispers on Mulberry Row grew louder. How many times would this happen? How many children would Jefferson father with a woman who couldn't refuse him? Madison Hemings arrived in January 1805, and this time Jefferson was at Monticello for the birth. He retired to his cabinet that night, working on correspondence, while Sally labored less than 300 yards away. By morning, he had another son, though he never publicly acknowledged the relationship. Madison looked even more like Jefferson than his siblings. As he grew, the resemblance became so obvious that visitors occasionally commented on it, though always in whispers, never directly to Jefferson himself. The boy had Jefferson's coloring, his facial structure, even some of his mannerisms picked up through observation. The pattern repeated in 1808 with the birth of his Stone Hemings, Sally's last child. 4 surviving children, now Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, all bearing the unmistakable stamp of Thomas Jefferson's features, all enslaved in his household, all destined to grow up in the shadow of a father who would never claim them. The enslaved community at Monticello developed its own understanding of these relationships. The Heming children occupied an awkward middle ground. neither fully part of the enslaved population working the fields, nor accepted as part of the white Jefferson family. They received better treatment than field hands, learned trades that might allow them to earn money eventually, but remained property nonetheless. Israel Jefferson, another enslaved man at Monticello, watched these children grow and remembered every detail. He saw Sally Hemings enter Jefferson's chamber many nights. He observed how Jefferson tracked her movements, showed concern for her health, ensured she received privileges denied to other enslaved women. The relationship was obvious to anyone with eyes, but nobody dared speak of it openly while Jefferson lived. The years of Jefferson's presidency from 1801 to 1809 created additional strain on this arrangement. When Jefferson was in Washington, Sally remained at Monticello with her children, living in a state of uncertainty. Would he return? Would he tire of her and sell her children? Would political enemies finally produce proof that would force him to acknowledge the truth? Jefferson's own writings from this period reveal a man increasingly anxious about his legacy. He wrote extensively about slavery, condemning it as a moral evil, while simultaneously insisting that immediate emancipation was impossible. He proposed schemes to deport freed slaves to Africa or the Caribbean, unable to imagine a society where black and white people might live together as equals. In private letters to friends, Jefferson expressed fears that Sally's children might eventually demand their freedom, might claim their heritage, might destroy the carefully constructed fiction of his moral authority. He discussed plans to solve the problem by sending them away once they reached adulthood, not freeing them, but making them somebody else's problem. The children themselves lived in a strange limbo. They worked, but not as hard as field hands. They learned skills. Beverly trained in carpentry, Madison in woodworking, Harriet in textile work that might make them valuable if sold or allowed to seek their own livelihoods. But they remained slaves, subject to Jefferson's absolute authority, unable to make decisions about their own lives. By 1810, after Jefferson retired from the presidency and returned to Monticello full-time, the plantation had become something resembling a small kingdom where Jefferson ruled without question. Visitors continued arriving, drawn by his reputation as a founding father, a philosopher, a scientist. They toured his gardens, admired his architecture, discussed politics and literature over meals prepared by enslaved cooks. But they never saw Mulberry Row except from a distance. They never learned the names of the people who kept Monticello functioning. They never asked uncomfortable questions about the mixed-race children who occasionally appeared in the background. The performance was so carefully maintained that most visitors left convinced Jefferson was exactly what he claimed to be, a reluctant slaveholder who treated his property humanely and looked forward to eventual emancipation. The reality was far darker. Jefferson's debts continued mounting. He owed tens of thousands of dollars to various creditors, and those debts grew larger each year as interest compounded. His enslaved people represented his largest asset. He could have sold them to pay his creditors, but he needed their labor to maintain his lifestyle. So they remained trapped, working to support a household that consumed far more than it produced. Sally Hemings herself, now in her late 30s, had aged visibly. 4 pregnancies, years of labor, the psychological toll of her situation, all of it showed in her face. Her posture, her eyes. She still lived in her small cabin along Mulberry Row, still performed her assigned duties, still came to Jefferson's chamber when summoned. But the relationship had changed. What might have once been complicated by youth and coercion had settled into something grimmer, a routine, an arrangement, a transaction that neither party could escape even if they wanted to. Jefferson's daughter, Martha Randolph, who managed the main house when her father was absent, understood the situation better than she ever acknowledged. She saw Sally's children growing up. She noticed their resemblance to her father. She watched how the enslaved people treated Sally with a difference that went beyond her position as a house servant. But Martha said nothing publicly, maintaining the family fiction that allowed her to continue benefiting from the labor of people who might be her half-siblings. This silence, this complicity extended throughout Jefferson's extended family. His grandchildren played with enslaved children without understanding the relationships. His sons-in-law managed the plantation's business without questioning where the mixed-race children came from. The entire household operated on an unspoken agreement that certain truths would never be acknowledged. But truth has a way of surfacing regardless of how deeply it's buried. In 1811, Harriet Hemings, now 9 years old, became seriously ill with scarlet fever. The illness swept through the enslaved quarters, killing several children and leaving others permanently damaged. Harriet survived, but barely. For weeks, she burned with fever, delirious, teetering on the edge of death. Jefferson, for the first time in anyone's memory, showed visible concern for an enslaved child's welfare. He authorized calling a doctor, an unprecedented expense for someone considered property. He checked on her condition multiple times daily. He ensured she received the best care available in rural Virginia. The enslaved people of Monticello noticed this special treatment and understood what it meant. Jefferson couldn't acknowledge Harriet as his daughter, couldn't claim her publicly, but he also couldn't simply let her die without trying to save her. His actions spoke truths. His words never would. Harriet recovered slowly, though the illness left her weakened. She would remain frail for years, susceptible to respiratory problems, never quite regaining the robust health she'd shown as a younger child. But she lived, and as she grew older, her resemblance to Jefferson became even more pronounced. People who visited Monticello and happened to glimpse her occasionally did double takes, confused by seeing what appeared to be a white child living among the enslaved population. Beverly, now 13, began working in the joinery with his uncle John Hemings, learning the woodworking trade. He showed talent for the work, producing furniture and architectural elements of remarkable quality. But he also showed something else, a growing awareness of his situation's absurdity. He was a skilled craftsman, producing valuable work, yet he owned nothing, earned nothing, could be sold at any moment if Jefferson needed money. Madison and Eston, still young boys, played in the way children do. But even they sensed the strangeness of their lives. They watched white children visit Monticello and then leave, traveling freely to places Madison and Eston could never go. They heard stories about cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, that might as well have been on the moon for all the chance they had of seeing them. Just when the pattern seemed settled, a moment of crisis arrived that would test Jefferson's carefully maintained silence in ways he hadn't anticipated. The weight of those unspoken truths was growing heavier with each passing year. The year 1817 brought changes to Monticello that would ultimately unravel parts of the carefully maintained fiction Jefferson had constructed around his relationship with Sally Hemings. Beverly, now 19 years old, had become a master carpenter whose work rivaled anything produced in Virginia. But he remained enslaved, legally property, his labor enriching Jefferson while he received only basic food, clothing, and shelter. That spring, Beverly disappeared. The disappearance was notable not for being violent or dramatic, but for being quiet and uncontested. One morning, Beverly was working in the joinery. By afternoon, he was gone. No alarm was raised, no search party assembled, no advertisements offering rewards for his capture appeared in Virginia newspapers. Jefferson noted the absence in his farm book with a single line, Beverly Runaway, 22. The age was wrong. Beverly was 19, not 22. But the message was clear. Jefferson was recording Beverly's departure as a runaway, giving himself legal cover while actually allowing his son to escape into freedom. The enslaved people of Monticello understood immediately what had happened. Jefferson had essentially freed Beverly without going through formal emancipation proceedings. He couldn't legally free Sally's children without inviting questions about why these particular enslaved people deserved freedom when others remained in bondage. So instead, he allowed Beverly to run away and made no effort to retrieve him. Beverly headed north, passing for white, which his appearance made easy. The last anyone at Monticello heard, he had reached Maryland, working as a carpenter under a different name. Sally watched her eldest son leave and felt the complex mixture of relief and grief that comes with knowing you'll likely never see a child again. Beverly was free, or as free as a fugitive slave could be, in a nation that still recognized Jefferson's legal claim to own him. But he was also gone, erased, transformed into someone else who would never acknowledge where he came from or who his parents were. Harriet followed her brother's path in 1822 when she was 20 years old. Jefferson again recorded her as runaway, allowing her to disappear north into freedom. She also passed for white, and like her brother, she vanished into the white population of the northern states. The pattern couldn't be ignored by those paying attention. Why were these particular enslaved people allowed to escape when others faced pursuit, capture, and brutal punishment for attempting the same thing? The answer was obvious to the enslaved community at Monticello, but they kept their knowledge to themselves. Speaking such truths could only bring trouble. Madison and Eston remained at Monticello to the 1820s. Now young men in their late teens and early 20s, Madison worked as a skilled carpenter like his brother. Eston learned violin from his father, one of the few direct interactions between Jefferson and his enslaved children that anyone ever witnessed. Jefferson loved music, played violin himself, and apparently couldn't resist teaching the skill to a son he would never publicly acknowledge. Edmund Bacon, who served as Jefferson's overseer during these years, witnessed scenes that troubled him enough that he remembered them decades later. He saw Jefferson emerge from Sally's quarters early in the morning on multiple occasions. He noticed how Jefferson ensured Sally received preferential treatment, better clothing, lighter work duties, a private cabin when most enslaved people lived in crowded shared quarters. Bacon said nothing at the time, understanding that his employment depended on maintaining the fiction. But he stored the memories away, evidence of what everyone at Monticello knew but dared not say. But Jefferson was failing. By 1825, he was 82 years old, increasingly frail, burdened by debts that now exceeded $100,000, an astronomical sum for the era. His health deteriorated steadily: severe diarrhea, painful urinary problems, difficulty sleeping. He knew he was dying and faced the problem of what would happen to Monticello, to his estate, to the more than 100 people he still held in slavery. His will, drafted in 1826, freed only 5 people by name: Madison Hemings, Estone Hemings, Burwell Colbert, Joe Fawcett, and John Hemings. All were male members of the Hemings family. All were skilled craftsmen whose labor had enriched Jefferson for decades. But notably, the will did not free Sally herself, though Jefferson made provisions suggesting she would be informally freed after his death. This was Jefferson's final compromise: acknowledge his sons just enough to free them, but do it in a way that required minimal explanation. He claimed he was rewarding faithful service, a fiction nobody believed, but also nobody could definitively disprove without Jefferson's cooperation. And Jefferson was beyond questioning. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, in a coincidence so perfect it seemed scripted. His last words were reportedly asking if it was the 4th yet, suggesting he wanted to survive to see the anniversary. John Adams, Jefferson's old rival and eventual friend, died the same day, creating a moment of historical synchronicity that Americans found almost supernatural in its symbolism. But while the nation mourned Jefferson as a founding father, a different drama played out at Monticello. Jefferson's debts forced the sale of nearly everything he owned, including most of the enslaved people. Families were separated, children torn from parents. People who had lived their entire lives at Monticello scattered across Virginia and beyond. The auction took place in January 1827 on the East Lawn, where Jefferson had once entertained distinguished visitors with philosophical discussions about liberty and natural rights. Now that same lawn became a market where human beings were sold to the highest bidder. The sale lasted 5 days. Each person was brought forward, examined like livestock, while potential buyers assessed their health, strength, and likely productivity. Sally Hemings was not officially freed in Jefferson's will, but she also wasn't sold. Martha Randolph allowed her mother's half-sister to remain at Monticello briefly, then quietly let her go live with Madison and Estone in Charlottesville. This informal freedom had no legal status. Technically, Sally remained enslaved property of Jefferson's estate, but nobody pursued the matter. She lived her remaining years in a small house in Charlottesville, cared for by her sons. The questions about Sally's children didn't end with Jefferson's death. In fact, they intensified among those who had witnessed the situation. Israel Jefferson, freed in the estate sale, carried with him memories of what he'd seen at Monticello. Edmund Bacon, the overseer, retained his observations of Jefferson's early morning departures from Sally's cabin. The truth lived in the memories of dozens of people who had been there, who had seen, who knew. Madison and Estone, now freed men living in Charlottesville, faced the choice of how to live in a society that offered limited options for free black men. The question of their paternity hung over them like a shadow. Everyone who looked at them could see the resemblance to Jefferson, but acknowledging it openly meant confronting truths that white Virginia society desperately wanted to ignore. Estone made his choice. In 1852, he moved to Ohio with his family, and within a few years, he had begun identifying as white. He changed his name, calling himself Estone H. Jefferson, taking his father's surname openly. Now, that distance made the connection less dangerous. His children grew up white, married white spouses, and carried forward Jefferson's bloodline without most people knowing the full story. Madison made a different choice. He remained in Virginia initially, then moved to Ohio in 1836, but he continued to identify as a black man. He married a free black woman named Mary Hughes McCoy and raised a family within the black community of Chillicothe, Ohio. He worked as a carpenter, earning respect for his craftsmanship, living quietly with the burden of a secret that most people wouldn't have believed even if he told them. Sally lived until 1835, dying at age 62 in Charlottesville. Her death went largely unnoticed by the white community. No obituary appeared in the newspapers. No marker was placed on her grave. She simply disappeared from the historical record as enslaved people typically did, leaving behind only fragments, a few mentions in Jefferson's farm book, some entries in account ledgers, the memories of her children. But the story of what happened at Monticello refused to die. Whispers continued circulating through Virginia society. Former Monticello slaves told their families what they'd witnessed. The Heming descendants carried forward their familial family's oral history, passing down the truth from generation to generation, even when white society refused to listen. In 1858, Beverly Hemings died in Washington City, having successfully lived as a white man for over 4 decades. His obituary made no mention of Monticello, slavery, or Thomas Jefferson. He had erased that part of his life completely, choosing survival over truth. Harriet Hemings died in 1865, shortly before the end of the Civil War that would have freed her if she had still been enslaved. Like her brother, she had lived as white, married a white man, raised children who never knew their grandmother had been enslaved or their grandfather had written the Declaration of Independence. The Civil War itself brought new attention to Jefferson's contradictions, as Union and Confederate forces fought over whether the nation could survive half slave and half free. People revisited Jefferson's writings about liberty and equality. How could the author of the Declaration have owned slaves? How could he have written that all men were created equal while keeping over 600 people in bondage throughout his lifetime? But even during the war, even as the contradiction became impossible to ignore, the specific allegations about Sally Hemings remained largely unspoken in polite society. The calendar articles from 1802 were remembered but dismissed as partisan attacks. The resemblance of the Heming children to Jefferson was acknowledged privately but denied publicly. The entire matter remained shrouded in a silence that protected Jefferson's reputation at the expense of truth. Stone Hemings died in Wisconsin in 1856 at age 51. He had successfully transformed himself into a white man, and his children continued that fiction. The connection to Jefferson became a family secret, whispered about privately but never discussed openly. Madison outlived all his siblings, dying in Ohio in 1877 at age 72. In his final years, as he watched the nation struggle with Reconstruction and the question of what freedom would mean for formerly enslaved people, Madison made a decision that would eventually change how history remembered his mother and Thomas Jefferson. In 1873, 4 years before his death, Madison Hemings sat down with Samuel Wetmore, a newspaper reporter from the Pike County Republican in Ohio, and told his story. For the first time, someone who had lived at Monticello, who had been born into slavery there, who had known Thomas Jefferson personally, spoke openly about what everyone there had known, but nobody had dared say. Madison stated plainly that Thomas Jefferson was his father. He described his mother's journey from Paris to Monticello, her relationship with Jefferson that had lasted nearly 40 years, the births of her children, the special treatment they received compared to other enslaved people. He named his siblings Beverly, Harriet, Stone, and explained how Beverly and Harriet had passed into white society while he had chosen to remain within the black community. The interview was published in March 1873, creating a small sensation among those who read it, but tellingly, it didn't reach a wide audience. White newspapers largely ignored it. Jefferson's white descendants dismissed it as fabrication. The story appeared in a small Ohio newspaper, not in the major publications that shaped national opinion. Madison provided details that only someone who had lived at Monticello could know. He described the layout of the plantation, the work routines, the personalities of various people who had lived there. He spoke about his uncle John Hemings teaching him carpentry, about learning to play violin, about watching his older siblings disappear north into freedom while he and Stone remained enslaved until Jefferson's death. He was matter-of-fact about his parentage, presenting it not as a scandal but as simple truth. Jefferson was his father. Sally Hemings was his mother. They had been together for decades. Everyone at Monticello knew it. The only mystery was why white society found this so difficult to accept. The interviewer, Wetmore, seemed inclined to believe Madison. The details were too specific, too accurate to be fabrication. Madison had nothing to gain from lying. He was an elderly man living quietly in Ohio with no apparent motive for seeking attention or notoriety. He was simply telling his story, putting on record what had happened, ensuring that some version of the truth survived him. But the publication of Madison's interview didn't lead to immediate acceptance of his claims. Instead, it created a dividing line that would persist for over a century. Some people believed him, mostly Black Americans who understood that white masters fathering children with enslaved women was common, not exceptional. Others dismissed his testimony, mostly white Americans who couldn't reconcile the revered founding father with the accusations of sexual exploitation. Israel Jefferson, the other formerly enslaved man who had witnessed Jefferson's relationship with Sally, also gave testimony in 1873, corroborating Madison's account. Israel described seeing Sally go to Jefferson's chamber, noted the resemblance of her children to Jefferson, confirmed the special treatment they received. His testimony supported Madison's in every particular. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's grandson and the son of Martha Jefferson Randolph, offered a counter-narrative. He claimed that Jefferson's nephews, Peter Carr and Samuel Carr, had actually fathered Sally's children. Jefferson Randolph suggested his grandfather had essentially taken blame to protect the younger men, a story that strained credibility, but served its purpose of deflecting accusations from Jefferson himself. The problem with the Carr explanation was timing. Peter and Samuel Carr weren't at Monticello during all of Sally's pregnancies. The documentary record clearly showed Jefferson's presence coinciding with the conceptions, while the Carrs were often elsewhere. But for those determined to protect Jefferson's reputation, implausible explanations were preferable to accepting uncomfortable truths. Edmund Bacon, Jefferson's former overseer, eventually shared his memories with a biographer, describing how he had seen Jefferson coming from Sally's room early in the morning. Bacon's testimony was damning in its casualness. He presented these observations as unremarkable, suggesting that at Monticello, everyone understood the nature of Jefferson and Sally's relationship. The evidence accumulated through these testimonies painted a consistent picture, multiple witnesses with no apparent reason to lie, independently confirming the same basic facts. Jefferson and Sally Hemings had been in a long-term sexual relationship. That relationship produced children. Those children looked like Jefferson. Jefferson showed them special favor, freeing the sons in his will, allowing Beverly and Harriet to escape into white society. The only people denying these facts were Jefferson's white descendants and historians invested in maintaining his heroic reputation. They constructed elaborate alternative explanations, attacked the credibility of Black witnesses, and insisted that Jefferson's character made such behavior impossible, despite overwhelming evidence that it was not only possible but it actually occurred. Madison Hemings died on November 28, 1877 in Huntington Township, Ross County, Ohio. He was 72 years old, a freed man who had lived long enough to see slavery abolished, to witness Reconstruction's brief promise and subsequent failure, to watch the nation struggle with questions of race and equality that his very existence embodied. His obituary in the local newspaper was brief, noting his death and his work as a carpenter. It didn't mention his connection to Thomas Jefferson. That story had been told, recorded in the 1873 interview, but it hadn't been widely believed or accepted. Madison took to his grave the knowledge that he had spoken the truth, but also the awareness that much of white America had chosen not to hear it. The house in Charlottesville, where Sally Hemings had lived her final years, was eventually torn down. No marker indicated she had been there. Her grave in the local Black cemetery received no headstone bearing her name. She disappeared into the anonymous mass of formerly enslaved people whose individual stories weren't considered worth preserving. Monticello itself passed through various hands after Jefferson's death. His heirs couldn't maintain it. The debts were too large, the property too expensive to operate. In 1834, it was sold to James Barclay, a Charlottesville druggist, for $7,000. Later owners included Uriah P. Levy, a naval officer who admired Jefferson and worked to preserve the property. The house gradually fell into disrepair, its glory days seemingly behind it. The enslaved people who had made Monticello function, who had cooked Jefferson's meals, built his furniture, maintained his gardens, raised his hidden children, were scattered across Virginia and beyond. Their descendants carried forward fragmented memories of what life had been like on the mountain, stories that often included details about Jefferson and Sally that contradicted the official narrative. The Jefferson family, particularly the white descendants through Martha Jefferson Randolph, maintained strict control over Jefferson's papers and legacy. They selectively preserved documents that presented Jefferson favorably while destroying or hiding those that complicated the picture. Letters were edited, passages removed, whole documents disappeared. The archive that survived reflected what the family wanted posterity to believe, not necessarily what had actually occurred. In the decades following Madison's death, historians writing about Jefferson largely ignored or dismissed the Hemings story. The testimony of enslaved people and their descendants wasn't considered reliable by white academics who dominated the field. The resemblance of Sally's children to Jefferson was acknowledged by some, but explained away as coincidence or attributed to other family members. The silence around this aspect of Jefferson's life became part of how America chose to remember its founding. The uncomfortable truths about power, exploitation, and the fundamental contradiction between slavery and liberty were buried beneath celebratory narratives about founding fathers and revolutionary ideals. But truth has a strange persistence. It survives in unexpected places, in family stories passed down through generations, in testimony given to small-town newspaper reporters, in the memories of people whose voices weren't considered worth recording by official history. The Heming descendants who had passed into white society carried forward their secret, some telling their children, others taking the knowledge to their graves. The descendants who remained within the black community preserved their oral history, insisting that Madison had told the truth even when white historians dismissed his testimony. By the end of the 19th century, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Some people knew it or believed it. Others denied it or remained ignorant of it. The evidence existed for those willing to examine it honestly, but most Americans preferred the simpler narrative of Jefferson as purely heroic figure, untainted by the compromises and cruelties that had characterized his actual life. The question of what happened at Monticello between 1802 and 1826 remained technically unresolved. Though the truth was obvious to anyone examining the facts without preconception, Jefferson had fathered Sally's children. He had kept them enslaved. He had freed some while allowing others to escape. He had maintained a relationship with a woman who couldn't legally refuse him, then taken its secret to his grave. Sally Hemings had survived that relationship, raised her children as best she could under impossible circumstances, and died without ever having been legally freed. Her children had made different choices about how to live with their mixed heritage, some passing for white, others remaining black, all of them carrying forward the complicated truth of their parentage. The enslaved people of Monticello, who had witnessed everything, who had known the truth all along, were mostly dead by 1877. Their testimony survived in fragments, in interviews given late in life, in stories told to children and grandchildren. But official history had largely chosen to ignore them, to privilege the voices of white people over black witnesses, to accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And so the story remained suspended between truth and denial, between what had actually happened and what white America was willing to acknowledge. The physical evidence, the children who looked like Jefferson had disappeared into white society or died, leaving descendants who might not know their own heritage. The documentary evidence had been carefully curated by Jefferson's heirs to minimize damage to his reputation. The witness testimony had been dismissed as unreliable. What remained was a mystery that wasn't really mysterious at all, a secret that everyone knew but pretended not to, a truth that America wasn't ready to confront. The horror of Monticello wasn't supernatural. It was the perfectly legal, socially acceptable exploitation of human beings by a man celebrated as a champion of liberty. It was the silence that surrounded that exploitation, the conspiracy of denial that protected Jefferson's reputation while erasing Sally Hemings from history. And perhaps the darkest truth was that Jefferson's relationship with Sally wasn't exceptional. Across the South, white men maintained similar relationships with enslaved women, fathered children who were born into slavery, exercised power that made consent impossible. What happened at Monticello was only remarkable because it involved Thomas Jefferson. Otherwise, it was simply how slavery worked, how the system operated, how power functioned in a society that treated human beings as property. The sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains on the day Madison Hemings died, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple, the same colors that had illuminated the night of Harriet's birth 75 years earlier. The mountain where Monticello stood remained solid and unchanging, holding its secrets close. The truth was there, embedded in the architecture, the soil, the very stones of the place, waiting for a future generation that might finally be willing to hear it. But for now, in 1877, as Madison was laid to rest in Ohio soil, far from the Virginia plantation where he'd been born into slavery, the story remained unfinished. The truth had been told but not believed, recorded but not accepted, preserved but not honored. And the fundamental questions about power and consent, about liberty and slavery, about who gets remembered and who gets erased, those questions remained unresolved, waiting for answers that wouldn't come for more than a century.